"You're just an old mechanic. You'll embarrass me in front of my new boss. Sit somewhere else." That's what my son-in-law said to me at one of the most expensive restaurants in the city, while pointing me toward a small table for one by the kitchen doors. I was 72 years old. I had put on my one good suit. My son-in-law, Brett, had told me this dinner was important, that he was up for a big promotion, that his new boss's company was involved somehow, and that having family there would look good. And I'd been glad to come because my daughter would be there, and I don't get to see my daughter as much as I'd like, and because, foolishly, I'll admit, some part of me was glad to be included at all. And then I arrived, and Brett took one look at me in my good suit, and his face did that thing it does, that little tightening of distaste, and he steered me away from the main table where my daughter and his in-laws were sitting, over toward a little two-top by the kitchen, and he said it. "You're just an old mechanic. You'll embarrass me in front of my new boss. Sit somewhere else." And my daughter, my Colette, looked down at her plate. She didn't defend me, and I understood why. I did, because Brett makes her life difficult when she crosses him, and I've never wanted to be the reason she pays for that. But it still went through me like a cold blade, watching my own girl study her napkin so she wouldn't have to meet my eyes. So I said, "That's all right, Brett." And I went and I sat at the little table for one by the kitchen doors. And a kind young waiter came over, a little embarrassed on my behalf, I think, and I ordered a coffee. Just a coffee. And I sat there in my good suit, alone, an old mechanic banished to the edge of the room, and I sipped my coffee and I watched my son-in-law across that restaurant, laughing too loud, working the table, waiting for his important new boss to arrive, and 5 minutes later, his boss walked in. And what happened next, I have replayed in my mind every single day since, and I still can't quite believe I got to see it with my own eyes. Because his boss walked into that restaurant, and everyone at the main table sat up straighter, and Brett stood and started to put out his hand, and the boss walked right past all of them, right past my son-in-law's outstretched hand, and he came across that entire dining room, straight to the little table by the kitchen where the old mechanic was sitting alone with his coffee. And he stopped in front of me, and his face was, I'll never forget it, his face was full of something like joy and something like disbelief, and he said, loud enough for that whole silent room to hear, "Mr. Trelinsky, my God, I didn't... Sir, it is an honor. It is genuinely an honor." And then he did something that I did not ask him to do and could not have stopped, and it changed my son-in-law's life forever. He turned around, and he walked back across that room to my son-in-law's table, and he set something down on the white tablecloth in front of Brett, and he said a few quiet sentences, and I watched my son-in-law's face go dead white, every drop of blood, white as the tablecloth. But I'm getting way ahead of myself, and none of this means what it needs to mean unless I tell it in order, because you need to understand who I actually am, and who that boss turned out to be, and what I'd spent 45 years building that my son-in-law never once bothered to ask about. And I promise you, it is not what you think, and it is so much better than a secret. So stay with me. And if you have ever been dismissed as just something, just a mechanic, just a laborer, just an old man, by someone too shallow to see what was right in front of them, reach down and hit that subscribe button right now. Because this is a story about a man who was called just an old mechanic, and about the day the whole room found out what that actually meant. Let me back up. My name is Amos Trelinsky. I'm 73 years old now, and this happened last year, when I was 72, and I've had a year to enjoy it, frankly, which I'll admit isn't the most gracious thing, but I'm an honest man and I won't pretend it wasn't sweet. Let me tell you who I am. Really who I am. Because my son-in-law was right about one thing and catastrophically wrong about everything else. He was right that I'm a mechanic. I am. I have been my whole life. These hands have been inside engines since I was 14 years old. I never went to college. I never wore a suit to work a day in my life until the very end. I am, in the most literal sense, an old mechanic, and I have grease under my fingernails that will be there when they bury me, and I'm proud of every bit of it. But here's what Brett never bothered to find out, because he'd decided who I was the moment he saw my hands. I am not just any mechanic. I am one of the finest engine builders this country has produced in the last 50 years. That is not me bragging. I'm too old to brag. And anyway, the work speaks for itself. When I was a young man, I discovered I had a gift, a real one, for high-performance engines, the kind that go in racing, in aviation, in specialized industrial and defense applications where an engine failing is not an inconvenience, it's a catastrophe. I could feel things in an engine that other men couldn't measure with instruments. I could build power and reliability into the same machine in ways that people said couldn't be done. Let me try to make you understand what that gift actually is, because people who've never done real craft don't quite get it. There's a point in any hard trade where the rules end and the feel begins. Any competent person can follow the manual, torque the bolts to spec, assemble the thing correctly. But there's a level above that, a level where you can lay your hand on a running engine and know, the way you know your own heartbeat, that something is a half-degree off, that a bearing will fail in 900 hours, that if you change one clearance by 0.02 of an inch, the whole machine will come alive. That's not in any manual. That comes from 30, 40 years of 10,000 engines passing through your hands until the knowledge lives in the hands themselves and not in your head at all. That's what I have. That's what those scarred hands Brett was so ashamed of actually are. They're 45 years of accumulated mastery that no amount of money or education can shortcut, because the only way to get it is to do it for a lifetime, and most people don't have the patience or the love for the work. My hands are the most valuable thing I own, and my son-in-law looked at them and saw dirt. And when I was 28 years old, I started a company. Out of a two-bay garage, with a partner who left after a year, and me buying out his half with money I didn't have. And over the next 45 years, that little garage became one of the most respected specialty engine and precision manufacturing firms in the entire country. We build and supply components and power systems that go into applications I'm not even fully at liberty to discuss. Aerospace, defense, high-end industrial. There are aircraft flying right now with my company's work inside them. When the biggest players in several very serious industries need something built to a standard nobody else can hit, they come to us. To me, to the old mechanic. I own that company. Outright, still, at 73, I never took it public, never sold out, because it was never about the money, it was about the work. It employs over 600 people. It is worth a great deal, though I've never much cared about the number. And in the industries that matter, my name, Trelinsky, is not a nobody's name. It's a name that men who've spent their lives in engineering and defense manufacturing say with respect, because they know exactly what it means and exactly how hard it is to do what we do. And my son-in-law had no idea, none, because he never once asked. That's the part I want you to sit with, because it's the whole story, really. In the years Brett had been married to my daughter, he had never once asked me what I did. Not really. He knew Colette's dad has some kind of shop, fixes engines or something. He'd decided, from my hands and my plain clothes and my lack of a degree, that I was a simple old grease monkey beneath his notice, an embarrassment to be managed at family functions. And it never occurred to him to check, because men like Brett don't investigate the people they've decided are beneath them. That would require imagining they might be wrong. Let me tell you about my wife, because she'd have loved this story and it kills me she didn't get to see it. Her name was Junie. We were married 48 years, and she passed 2 years ago, her heart, and she was the only person who was ever truly my equal. And losing her took something out of me I'll never get back. Junie kept the books of that company for the first 15 years, at our kitchen table, same as she kept everything. She was the business half and I was the building half, and together we were unstoppable. And she used to laugh and say, "Amos, someday somebody's going to underestimate you because of those hands, and I only hope I'm in the room to watch what happens." She wasn't in the room, but I like to think she saw it anyway, because it happened exactly the way she always said it would. I want to tell you one more thing about Junie, because it's the thing that made her my equal, and it's the thing I lost. She understood value, real value, as opposed to price. She used to say there were two kinds of people in the world, people who ask what something costs and people who ask what something is worth, and that the whole trick of a good life was learning to tell them apart and keep the second kind close. She built our company's reputation on it. She turned down business, good money, from people she could tell only cared about price, because she knew they'd chisel us and leave the moment someone cheaper came along, and she'd give her heart to the customers who understood what we actually made. She was almost never wrong about a person. When Colette brought Brett home, Junie was polite, always, but I caught her watching him with that same careful look, and after he left the first time she said to me quietly, washing dishes, "That one asks what things cost, Amos. Watch him." She saw it in an evening. It took me years and a corner table to see what my wife saw over the dinner dishes. God, I miss her judgment. I miss all of her, but I miss her judgment most, because the world is full of Bretts and she could spot them across a room. Let me tell you about Colette, my daughter, because I don't want you thinking badly of her, and this story is, in a strange way, partly about saving her. Colette is 36, and she is a good, kind, gentle person, and she married the wrong man. It happens. Brett was charming when they met. Men like him are always charming. Charm is their whole toolkit. And by the time his real nature showed, they were married. And Colette is the kind of soul who tries to make things work, who blames herself, who keeps the peace. And Brett had, over their years together, slowly made her small, made her doubt herself, made her afraid of his moods. It's a thing I'd watched happen from a distance, with a growing anger I kept swallowing because Colette begged me to, because every time I tried to say something, it made her life harder afterward. So I had learned to stay quiet, to bite my tongue, to watch my son-in-law belittle my daughter and belittle me and say nothing, for her sake, for years. That's important because it's why what happened at that restaurant was not something I did. I want to be very clear about that. I did not engineer one bit of it. I had spent years specifically not using who I was to interfere, because Colette had asked me not to make waves. What happened at that restaurant happened entirely because of Brett's own mouth, and the one person in that room he should have been kind to. Let me tell you about Brett, and I'll be as fair as I can manage, which I'll admit isn't very. Brett is 38, and he is a striver. Not a builder, a striver, and there's a world of difference. He doesn't make anything. He climbs. He is obsessed with status, with titles, with impressing the right people and being seen at the right tables. He is the kind of man who treats the people above him like gods and the people below him like furniture, and who genuinely believes that's just how the world works. He works in business development for a firm in the defense and aerospace supply world, which, if you're paying attention, is going to matter enormously in about 2 minutes. And Brett had spent his whole marriage to my daughter viewing me as a liability, an embarrassment, the old grease monkey father-in-law he had to occasionally tolerate. He would introduce me when he had to as Colette's dad. He's retired, never what I did, because he assumed what I did was nothing worth mentioning. And I let him. I let him think it for years, because correcting him would have meant a scene, and Colette didn't need a scene. There was one Christmas that still stings, a couple of years back, not long after. Junie died. Brett's family was there, and someone, his mother, I think, politely asked me what I did for a living, just making conversation. And before I could answer, Brett jumped in with a little laugh and said, "Oh, Amos tinkers with cars. He's got a little shop. He's basically retired now." Tinkers, with cars, a little shop. And everyone nodded and the conversation moved on, and I sat there and did not correct my son-in-law in front of his family, because Colette shot me a look that begged me not to, and I loved her more than I wanted to defend myself. 600 employees. Aircraft flying with my work in them. Contracts with names I can't say out loud, and my son-in-law introduced it as Tinkers with Cars, and I ate it for my daughter's sake, and I went home to my empty house and I talked to Junie's photograph about it, because she was the only one who'd have understood the size of what I was swallowing. I tell you that so you understand. The restaurant wasn't the first time. It was just the first time he did it in front of exactly the wrong man. Now, let me tell you about that dinner. Brett had called Colette, who called me, and the message was that Brett was up for a significant promotion at his firm, that there was a big deal in the works with a major partner company, and that his new boss, a man who'd recently come in over him, wanted to have a dinner, and that Brett wanted family there to look grounded and stable, and would I come? And I said yes, because Colette would be there, and because, I'll be honest, a small, hopeful, foolish part of me thought maybe this was Brett finally trying to include me, finally warming up. Fathers are foolish that way about their children's spouses. We keep hoping. So I put on my good suit, my one good suit that I'd bought for Junie's funeral and worn maybe 3 times since, and I drove to the restaurant, and I walked in, and Brett saw me, and I watched his face fall. That flash of distaste. Because even in my good suit, I suppose I look like what I am, an old workingman, big scarred hands, not polished, not sleek, and Brett had a vision of this dinner, and I did not fit it. And he came over, fast, before I could reach the main table where I could see Colette sitting with Brett's in-laws, and he took my elbow and steered me toward a little two-top by the kitchen, and he said it, low and sharp. "You're just an old mechanic. You'll embarrass me in front of my new boss. Sit here, please. Just sit here and have a coffee and don't make this weird." And Colette saw. I know she did. And she looked down at her plate and my heart broke a little. And I understood. And I did not blame her. And I said, "That's all right, Brett." And I sat down at the little table for one by the kitchen doors, and I ordered a coffee, and I waited, because what else does an old man do? And I want to tell you what I was feeling, sitting there, because it wasn't rage. I've earned enough respect in my life from people who actually matter, from the finest engineers and manufacturers and operators in the country, that one shallow young man's contempt couldn't really touch the core of me. What I felt was sad. Sad that my daughter had married a man so small that he could look at another human being and see only a suit that wasn't nice enough. And I'll tell you what I thought about sitting at that little table by the kitchen with my coffee, because it surprised me. I didn't think about revenge. I thought about my own father. He was a working man too, a bricklayer, hands like mine, and I remembered being a young man, maybe Brett's age, and being embarrassed of him once, at some function, because he was rough and plain among polished people. Just once. And I've carried the shame of that one time my whole life, because my father was twice the man any of those polished people were, and I was too young and stupid to see it, and by the time I understood he was gone and I couldn't tell him. So, sitting there, watching my son-in-law be ashamed of me, what I mostly felt was a kind of sad recognition. Because I'd been Brett once, for one evening, 50 years ago. The difference is I grew out of it, and it taught me something. And I spent the rest of my life making sure I never looked at a working man's hands with anything but respect. Brett was 38 and still hadn't learned it, and I found myself hoping, even then, even banished to my corner, that he'd learn it, before it was too late for him the way it almost was for me. He was about to learn it, just not the gentle way, and then his boss walked in. Now. Here is what I did not know, sitting at that little table. I did not know who Brett's new boss was. Brett had never said a name to me, and I certainly did not know the thing that was about to detonate this entire evening, which was this. Brett's firm, the one where he was chasing his big promotion, was in the middle of trying to close a major supply and partnership deal. And the company on the other side of that deal, the critical partner whose components they could not do this without, the firm they were desperate to lock in, was mine. Trelinsky Precision. My company, the old mechanics company. Brett did not know that. He genuinely did not know that his father-in-law owned the company his own firm was bending over backwards to partner with. Because he'd never asked what I did. He'd have had to know what my company was called, and then connect it to the deal his own firm was working, and he'd never bothered to learn the first thing, so he couldn't possibly make the connection. His contempt had kept him ignorant of the single most important fact in his own career. And the man who walked into that restaurant, his new boss, the man brought in over him, was a man named Desmond Okoro. And Desmond Okoro had, 20 years earlier, as a young engineer, done a 2-year stretch at my company. Early in his career. He'd been one of the bright ones, and I'd mentored him, personally, taught him things on the shop floor with my own hands, and he'd gone on to a big career in the industry, and we'd stayed loosely in touch over the years, the way you do with someone whose start you had a hand in. Desmond Okoro knew exactly who I was. Desmond Okoro had, as a young man, considered it one of the great privileges of his career to learn at the elbow of Amos Trelinsky. I remember Desmond as a young man, actually, and it makes what happened even sweeter. He came to us green, book-smart, but with no feel yet, a little arrogant the way brilliant young engineers often are. And I remember the day it clicked for him. I'd had him rebuild a particular assembly 3 times, because he kept doing it correctly on paper and wrong in reality, and the third time he finally stopped arguing with the engine and started listening to it, and I watched the understanding come over his face, that moment when a young man realizes the manual isn't the whole truth. And he looked up at me, greased to his elbows for the first time, and he grinned, and I knew he'd be one of the good ones. You don't forget teaching a person to see, and they don't forget learning it. So when Desmond walked into that restaurant 20 years later, a successful man in his own right, and saw the old teacher who'd taught him to listen to engines being shoved into a corner by some status-chasing subordinate, you can understand that it wasn't just professional respect that moved him. It was something closer to a son seeing his father disrespected. That's the debt of a real teacher, and Desmond is a man who honors his debts. And here's the thing that made it all come apart, the piece you gave me, the piece that turns it from luck into justice. Desmond Okoro had arrived a few minutes early, and he'd been standing near the entrance, unnoticed, checking his coat, when Brett steered me to that little table by the kitchen. He saw it. He saw the whole thing. He saw my son-in-law take an old man by the elbow and banish him to a table for one. And, though he couldn't hear every word from there, he saw the body language, the contempt, the shame of it, and he saw the old man go sit down alone. And then Desmond Okoro walked further into that restaurant, and he looked at the old man sitting alone by the kitchen, and he realized who it was. And you can imagine what went through that man's mind. Here was Amos Trelinsky, a man he revered, a man whose company his own firm was desperate to partner with, a legend in their shared industry, being treated like garbage, banished to a corner table by the very employee who'd invited them all here to be impressed. Desmond Okoro stood there and understood, in an instant, exactly what kind of man Brett was. Not from a rumor, not from a review. From watching him, with his own eyes, publicly humiliate a person he thought was powerless and beneath him. That's the thing, you see. That's what actually ended Brett. It wasn't just that I turned out to be important. It's that Brett had revealed his entire character, his cruelty, his shallowness, his contempt for anyone he thought couldn't do anything for him, in front of the one person whose respect his whole career depended on. He showed Desmond Okoro exactly who he was, at the worst possible moment aimed at the worst possible target. So Desmond walked across that room, past Brett's outstretched hand, past the main table, straight to me. And he stood in front of my little table, and his face lit up, and he said, "Mr. Trelinsky, my God, I didn't— Sir, it is an honor. It is genuinely an honor." And I stood up, because you stand up for people who've earned it, and Desmond Okoro is a fine man. And I shook his hand and I said, "Desmond, look at you. It's good to see you, son." And the whole restaurant had gone quiet, because everyone at that main table was watching their important new boss, the man they'd all come to impress, greet the banished old mechanic by the kitchen like visiting royalty. And Brett's face, across the room, was a study. Confusion. Then a dawning, creeping horror. Then something close to panic because he was just starting, to understand that something had gone very, very wrong, and he didn't yet know how bad. And then Desmond did the thing. He didn't shout. He didn't make a speech. He walked back across that room to the main table, and he stood in front of Brett, and he took a business card out of his jacket. My company's card, as it happened, that had my name on it. Amos Trelinsky, founder and chairman, Trelinsky Precision, and he set it down on the white tablecloth in front of Brett. And he said quietly, but in the total silence of that room, everyone heard it. "Do you know who that gentleman is, Brett? That's Amos Trelinsky. He's the founder and owner of Trelinsky Precision, the company we have spent 8 months trying to get to partner with us. The company this entire deal, your promotion, all of it, depends on. That's his company, and he's your father-in-law, and I just watched you put him at a table by the kitchen because you were ashamed of him." And that is when my son-in-law's face went dead white. And I want to describe the whole table in that moment, because I had a clear view of it from my little seat by the kitchen, and I've never seen anything quite like it. Brett's in-laws, his own parents, sat frozen, their faces cycling through confusion, and then a kind of second-hand horror as they understood that their son had just done something catastrophic. Brett's mother put her hand over her mouth. and Colette, my Colette. I watched my daughter's face do the most complicated thing of all. Shock, yes. But underneath the shock, something I hadn't seen on her face in years, a kind of awakening. She looked across that room at me, sitting alone with my coffee, and then back at her white-faced husband, and I could see her recalculating everything, every time she'd been made to feel small, every time she'd looked at her plate instead of defending her father, and understanding all at once that she'd been ashamed of the wrong man for years, and Brett himself just sat there. He picked up the business card off the tablecloth with a shaking hand and looked at it. My name, founder and chairman, and I watched him read it 3 or 4 times as if it might change, as if there'd been some mistake. There was no mistake. There was just a man discovering in real time and in public the exact dimensions of his own blindness, because he understood all at once the full magnitude of what he had just done. He had publicly humiliated, in front of his own boss, in front of his in-laws, in front of a room full of people, the one man on earth who held his entire career in his hands. He had called Amos Trelinsky just an old mechanic and banished him to a corner, and it turned out Amos Trelinsky was the reason he had a shot at any of it. And he'd revealed himself to be exactly the kind of small, cruel, status-obsessed man that no one wants to promote and no one wants to do a deal with. Now, I want to be very honest and very careful about what happened next, because this is where these stories go stupid, and I promised you the truth. Desmond did not fire Brett on the spot with a magic letter across a tablecloth. That's not how any of this works, and I wouldn't want you to believe it does. There was no termination notice slid across the table. There was a business card, and there was the truth, spoken plainly, and that turned out to be more than enough. What actually happened is quieter and I think more devastating. The promotion evaporated. Not with a dramatic announcement, it just quietly never happened, the way these things don't happen. Because Desmond Okoro was not going to elevate a man he had personally watched publicly humiliate a vulnerable elderly person he'd assumed was powerless. That single act had told Desmond everything he needed to know about Brett's character, and you do not promote a man like that into a position of more power over more people. Desmond told me later, when we spoke, "Amos, I didn't need to do anything to him. He did it to himself. I just watched. And the moment I saw him do that to you, I knew I could never trust him with anything or anyone. Character revealed is character revealed. And the deal? The deal between our companies went forward, actually, because I am a professional, and business is business, and I wasn't going to blow up a good partnership and hurt 600 of my employees and however many of theirs over one contemptuous young man. But it went forward without Brett anywhere near it. He was quietly moved off it. His star, which had been rising, simply stopped rising, because everyone who mattered now knew what he was, and in a tight industry, that kind of thing travels. And I want to be honest about why that's fair, because I can imagine someone thinking it's harsh that one bad night cost a man his momentum. Here's the thing. It wasn't one bad night. It was one revealing night. Brett didn't have a moment of weakness and snap at someone under stress. That happens to everyone, and it's forgivable. What Brett did was calmly, deliberately, in a good mood, with plenty of time to think, choose to humiliate a person he believed was powerless and beneath him, in order to protect his own image. That's not a mistake. That's a window into how a man treats people when he thinks it's safe to be his true self. And the whole point of the window is that it tells you what he'll do to his own staff, his own reports, anyone he has power over, the moment he thinks no one important is watching. Desmond understood that instantly, because Desmond has spent his life around both kinds of people. You do not hand more power to a man who abuses the powerless. That's not vindictiveness. That's just competent judgment about character. Brett revealed himself to be exactly the kind of leader who poisons an organization, and he revealed it to the one man with both the knowledge and the position to make sure it mattered. His contempt didn't just insult me. It was a job interview, and he failed it in the most spectacular way possible without even knowing he was in one. I did not do any of that, I want to be clear. I never made a single call, never asked for a single consequence. I didn't have to. Brett detonated his own career with his own mouth, in front of exactly the wrong person, and all I did was drink my coffee. Which is what I did. That's the part I'm proudest of, honestly. While all of this was unfolding, the recognition, the reveal, Brett's face going white, the whole table frozen in horror, I sat back down at my little table by the kitchen, and I finished my coffee. Slowly. Every drop. And then I stood up, and I put some money on the table for the kind young waiter, and I walked over to the main table, and I did not gloat, because I'm not built that way, and because my daughter was sitting right there. I just leaned down and I kissed Colette on the top of the head, and I said, "It was good to see you, sweetheart. Call me tomorrow." And I nodded to Desmond and I said, "Good to see you, son. Don't be a stranger." And I did not say one single word to Brett. Not one. I just looked at him for a moment, this man who'd called me an old mechanic, and then I walked out of that restaurant into the night air and I drove home. And by the time I got home, my phone had started. Brett calling again, Colette calling, Brett again. By the next morning, there were over 50 missed calls on my phone, most of them Brett's, and I hadn't answered a single one, because I had nothing to say to him that a phone call could hold, and because, frankly, an old mechanic gets to decide who's worth his time. Now, the honest rest of it, because these stories always want to end at the restaurant and life is longer than that. Brett and my daughter are divorced now, and I want to tell you the truth about my part in that, because I won't pretend to be nobler than I am. I didn't cause it. But that night cracked something open, because Colette had spent years being told, subtly and not so subtly, that she and her family were less than, that her old grease monkey father was an embarrassment, that she should be grateful Brett had elevated her. And that night, she watched the whole edifice of Brett's superiority collapse in about 90 seconds. She watched her embarrassing father be treated with more genuine respect than her status-obsessed husband had ever earned, and something shifted in her. She saw Brett clearly, maybe for the first time, saw the smallness of him, the cruelty, revealed under pressure. And she saw me, the father she'd been quietly taught to be a little ashamed of, stand up and be someone. She called me the next morning, as I'd asked, and we talked for a long time, longer than we'd talked in years. And over the following months, with some distance and some courage she found somewhere, she left him. On her own. I want to be clear, it was her decision, her strength. But I think that night gave her back something Brett had taken. A sense of what she came from, and that it was nothing to be ashamed of. She's living with me for now, actually, while she gets back on her feet, and it is the greatest gift of my old age, having my girl back under my roof, her laugh back in the house that went so quiet after Junie. We have coffee every morning, real coffee, at a real table, together. Not an old man banished to the edge of a room, but a father and a daughter, side by side, the way it was always supposed to be. Brett, I don't think about much. Last I heard, his career had stalled badly, that the shine had come off him in the industry, that the whispered story of the man who humiliated his own father-in-law, who turned out to be a legend, had followed him around. I don't take pleasure in his troubles exactly, but I don't lose sleep over them either. He made his bed with his own contempt. Desmond Okoro and I are back in proper touch, and it does my heart good. The partnership between our companies has been excellent, and every so often we have dinner, at a good table, in the middle of the room, and we talk shop, 2 engine men, one old and one not as old, and it reminds me that the respect that matters comes from people who understand what you actually do, not from people impressed by the price of your suit. Here's the thing I keep coming back to, and then I'll let you go. My son-in-law called me just an old mechanic, and he was right, that's exactly what I am. Big scarred hands, grease under the nails, no degree, a plain man who spent his life building engines. He had it completely right. What he got wrong, catastrophically, career-endingly wrong, was the word just. Because there is no just about mastering a craft. There is no just about being one of the best in the country at a genuinely hard thing. There is no just about 45 years of building something real with your own 2 hands. Brett spent his whole life chasing titles and status and the appearance of importance, and he looked at a man who had actual mastery, actual respect, actual substance, and because that man had scarred hands and a cheap suit, Brett saw nothing. He'd been trained his whole life to read status off the surface of things, and it left him completely blind to the real thing when it was sitting right in front of him drinking a coffee. And that's the thing I'd want you to take from this, if you take anything. Be very, very careful about the word just. The just a janitor might have more integrity than everyone in the boardroom. The just a waitress might be putting 3 kids through school on her own. The just an old mechanic might be a master of his craft, whose name is spoken with reverence by people you'll never be important enough to meet. When you dismiss someone as just anything, you're not describing them. You're describing the smallness of your own vision. My son-in-law couldn't see me, and it cost him everything. And the tragedy is, he still probably thinks he was unlucky rather than blind. I was never just an old mechanic. I was an old mechanic, and that, it turns out, was more than enough. So let me ask you something, and I do read these. Have you ever been underestimated, dismissed as just something, and watched someone realize too late how wrong they were? What was that moment like? I'd love to hear it because I've learned there's a deep, quiet strength in being underestimated, and I suspect many of you know it better than I do. And here's the one that matters more to me. Is there someone in your life you might be guilty of underestimating? Someone you filed under just something, without ever really asking who they are? I'm not asking to shame anyone. I did it myself for years about people before life humbled me. I'm asking because the most interesting, remarkable people I've ever known rarely looked the part, and I'd hate for you to miss one the way my son-in-law missed me. Maybe go ask them a real question this week. You might be astonished. That's all I've got tonight. If it meant something to you, hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you at the next one.